What if I told you that the ancient Persian Empire never really disappeared, but transformed into modern-day Iran? This empire once stretched across vast lands, shaping the course of history, but what's its connection to biblical prophecy? Let's dive into the powerful legacy of Persia that still resonates today. In this video, we'll uncover the rich, 5,000-year history of Persia, tracing its rise from an ancient empire to the modern nation of Iran. Along the way, we'll explore how this long history ties directly into God's plan for nations, reflecting spiritual truths that apply to us as Catholics today. From the biblical figure of Cyrus the Great to Iran's current role in the Middle East, we'll explore the empire that refused to die and how its history shapes modern global events. Join me as we reflect on how these events intertwine with God's sovereign plan for His people. 1. The birth of Persia and its ancient civilization. Persia, with its roots stretching back at least 5,000 years, is one of the most significant yet often overlooked civilizations in history. Its story begins long before the rise of the great empires of Egypt or Mesopotamia, and yet its influence has shaped the trajectory of history in profound ways. Understanding the early history of Persia offers us important insights not only into the ancient world but also into the way God's plan for the nations unfolds. The earliest known settlers in the area now called Iran were the Elamites, an ancient civilization that thrived around 3000 BCE in the southwestern part of what is now Iran. The Elamites built cities such as Susa, which was one of the oldest urban settlements in the world. These early Persians were not yet the people we think of today, but their influence and their land played a key role in shaping the larger picture of the ancient Near East. It's important to note that the Elamites, though not ethnically Persian, laid much of the groundwork for later civilizations in the region, particularly in terms of urbanization and governance. Moving forward, the region was home to several important cultures, and it wasn't long before the area became the cradle of the ancient Persian Empire. By around 700 BCE, the Medes, an Iranian-speaking people, rose to prominence in the region. They were a major force in the overthrow of the Assyrian Empire, alongside the Babylonians. The Medes established a kingdom that would eventually become the foundation for the greater Persian Empire. Their greatest contribution to history came in the form of an alliance with the Persians, under the leadership of King Cyrus the Great, which would lead to the formation of the Achaemenid Empire in 550 BCE. Cyrus the Great's rise to power is one of the most significant events in the ancient world, and his story is pivotal in understanding the role of Persia in God's divine plan. The Bible itself provides us with insight into Cyrus's role in history. In Isaiah 45:1, God calls Cyrus his anointed, despite him not being an Israelite. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of, to subdue nations before him. Cyrus's decree to allow the Israelites to return to their homeland is a key moment in the Bible, as it shows God working through even a foreign, secular ruler to bring about his promises. Cyrus's success was not just military but political as well. He founded one of the largest empires in history, stretching from the Indus River in the east to Egypt in the west. His empire was notable not only for its size but for its relative tolerance of the various cultures and religions within its borders. This approach allowed Persia to govern a vast and diverse empire for over 2 centuries. This principle of tolerance and respect for local customs would later be mirrored in various biblical narratives where God uses empires to fulfill His greater purposes. For the ancient Persians, this period marked the beginning of their golden age. The Achaemenid Empire, under leaders like Darius and Xerxes, grew even larger, extending its influence across the Mediterranean, Asia Minor, and beyond. The Achaemenid dynasty represented the height of Persian power, and their accomplishments, such as the construction of the Royal Road and the establishment of efficient systems of governance, were monumental. Spiritually, Persia's role in biblical history is significant. God's use of Cyrus shows us that His purposes are often beyond our understanding. God was at work through a ruler who did not know Him personally, yet He used Cyrus to fulfill His covenant promise to Israel. This serves as a reminder that God is sovereign over all the nations, and He can use anyone, regardless of their background, to bring about His will. As Catholics, this also calls us to reflect on our own role in God's plan. Like Cyrus, we may not fully understand the ways in which God is using us, but we are still called to trust in His purposes, just as Israel did when they returned to Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. Persia's ancient history, from the Elamites to Cyrus's empire, serves as a testimony to God's faithfulness across generations and nations, showing that no empire or civilization is beyond His reach. 2. The Persian Empire and the rise of Cyrus the Great. The rise of Cyrus the Great is one of the most pivotal moments in both ancient history and biblical prophecy. As the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, Cyrus transformed Persia from a relatively small kingdom into one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indus River. But it wasn't just his military conquests that made Cyrus significant. It was his role in fulfilling God's plan for His people, as recorded in the Bible. Cyrus's military genius and vision allowed him to unite the various Iranian tribes and defeat the powerful Median Empire. After conquering the Medes, he extended his empire to include Lydia in Anatolia and then the Babylonian Empire itself, where his remarkable strategy allowed him to conquer the city of Babylon without significant bloodshed. But what truly set Cyrus apart was his treatment of the peoples he conquered. Unlike many other rulers of his time, Cyrus believed in the idea of tolerance and respect for local customs and religions. Instead of imposing Persian culture and religion on his subjects, he allowed conquered peoples to maintain their traditions. This respect for diversity made Cyrus's empire unique, and it was one of the reasons why his reign lasted as long as it did. He understood that a united empire is built on the foundation of peace and understanding, not just power and domination. In the biblical context, Cyrus's story is of profound significance. In the book of Isaiah, God calls Cyrus His anointed one in a surprising declaration. Isaiah 45:1 reads, "This is what the Lord says to His anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of, to subdue nations before him." This is extraordinary because Cyrus was a pagan king, not an Israelite. Yet God used him to bring about His divine will. In fulfilling this prophecy, Cyrus issued a decree that allowed the Jews to return to their homeland after the Babylonian exile. This decree set the stage for the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the Temple, marking a key moment in biblical history. For the Jewish people, Cyrus represented both hope and fulfillment. After decades of exile, they were given the opportunity to return to their land and rebuild what had been destroyed. This moment is significant not just in the context of Jewish history, but also in understanding the broader scope of God's plan for the nations. It's a reminder that God's work is not limited to one people or one kingdom, but that His sovereignty extends over all the earth. He can raise up rulers from unexpected places to fulfill His promises. Cyrus's reign also holds a deeper spiritual lesson for us today. His story reflects God's ability to work through unexpected individuals, nations, and events to fulfill His will. No matter how difficult or seemingly impossible a situation may be, we can trust that God's plan will ultimately prevail. Even when it appears that human efforts and worldly powers are in control, God's purposes are at work behind the scenes, guiding history according to His divine plan. For Catholics, this is a powerful reminder to trust in God's sovereignty, even in the midst of political or personal upheaval. Just as Cyrus played a role in God's plan, so too are we called to live faithfully, trusting that God can use us in ways that may not always be clear to us. Our lives, though marked by challenges and uncertainties, are part of a larger divine story, just as Persia's role in history was integral to God's plan for Israel. Cyrus's legacy as a ruler who respected and empowered those he conquered is also an example of how God calls us to treat others with dignity and respect. In a world filled with division, we can take a lesson from Cyrus's example, using our positions of influence to promote peace, unity, and understanding rather than domination and control. Ultimately, the rise of Cyrus the Great and the Persian Empire reminds us of the profound ways in which God works through human history, using even the most unlikely instruments to bring about His will. As we look at world events today, we should remember that just as Persia rose to power through God's direction, so too does God continue to work in and through the nations to fulfill His purposes for His people. 3. Persia's influence on Greece and the decline of the Achaemenid Empire. The Persian Empire, under Cyrus the Great and his successors, rose to prominence as one of the world's largest and most influential empires. Yet despite its vast territory and powerful armies, the Achaemenid Empire eventually encountered its greatest challenge, the Greek city-states. The conflict between Persia and Greece, particularly during the Greco-Persian Wars, would become a defining moment in ancient history. Despite their differences in culture and size, the Greeks managed to hold off the mighty Persian Empire. The famous Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE and the heroic stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae in 480 BCE became symbols of Greek resistance against Persian expansion. Yet Persia's influence remained significant in the region, despite these setbacks. The Greco-Persian Wars did not erase Persia's power. Instead, they set the stage for a long-term rivalry between East and West. From a biblical perspective, Persia's enduring influence, even after military defeats, serves as a reminder that God's sovereignty transcends human victories and losses. In Proverbs 21:1, we are reminded, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse, wherever He pleases." This passage illustrates how, even in times of military defeat or political decline, God's ultimate control over kingdoms and empires remains unshaken. While the Greeks secured their independence, Persia's influence remained strong, particularly through diplomacy. King Artaxerxes, for example, played a significant role in shaping Greek politics. In fact, after the Greco-Persian Wars, Persia used diplomacy and alliances to subtly pull the strings of Greek politics. Artaxerxes was able to influence Greek city-states, even without sending armies to the battlefield. In this way, Persia's control was not solely based on military might, but also on political maneuvering. A reminder that power often comes from strategic alliances and influence, not just force. This principle applies to our lives today. Just as Persia learned to adapt and influence events from behind the scenes, we too are called to recognize the spiritual influence we can have in our daily lives, not through force, but through prayer, wisdom, and steadfast faith. Like Persia, we may face setbacks and challenges, but God uses those moments to shape our path. The fall of the Achaemenid Empire, eventually conquered by Alexander the Great in 330 BCE, was a significant event, but it didn't signify the end of Persia's influence. God's hand remained at work even in the collapse of empires, reminding us that while kingdoms may rise and fall, God's eternal plan unfolds through all of human history. For Catholics, this calls us to trust in God's sovereignty, recognizing that His plan for His people, whether Israel or the Church, remains intact, no matter the rise or fall of nations. 5. The Persian legacy, Parthians, Sassanids, and the Islamic conquest. The legacy of Persia continues to be felt long after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire in 330 BCE. Though the mighty empire was overrun by Alexander the Great, Persia's influence never fully dissipated. The subsequent empires of the Parthians and Sassanids would continue Persia's heritage, keeping its spirit alive in new forms and ways. The Parthian Empire, 247 BCE, 224 CE, was the first major Iranian dynasty to rise after the fall of the Achaemenids. They established a strong foothold in the region and became a major rival to the Roman Empire. The Parthians managed to maintain a large, multi-ethnic empire stretching from the Iranian plateau to parts of Central Asia and Mesopotamia. Their strategic use of cavalry and diplomacy helped them resist the Roman Empire, and they managed to maintain their power for several centuries. However, it was the Sassanid Empire, 224–651 CE, that truly restored the glory of ancient Persia. The Sassanids, who took control after the fall of the Parthians, expanded Persia's territory, fought multiple wars with Rome, and cemented Zoroastrianism as the state religion. The Sassanid Empire was a powerful force in the Middle East, and its rivalry with the Roman and Byzantine empires continued for centuries. But just as Persia had faced foreign conquests before, the Sassanid Empire eventually fell to the Arab Muslim armies in the 7th century, marking a dramatic shift in Persia's political and religious landscape. The Arab conquest of Persia not only resulted in the spread of Islam across the region, but also led to the significant cultural and religious transformation of Persia. Despite this, the Persian people maintained a distinct identity, and many of the traditions, customs, and languages of the ancient Persian world survived, albeit in a transformed way. From a biblical perspective, this shift in Persia's history aligns with God's larger plan for the nations. In Jeremiah 29:10, God promises to bring his people back to their land after their exile, and his hand was at work in the turbulent history of Persia, shaping its destiny for his purposes. The fall of the Sassanids and the rise of the Islamic Caliphate did not mean the end of Persia's significance. Rather, it marked a new chapter in the unfolding of God's greater plan for the world. For Catholics, this history is a reminder of God's sovereignty over the kingdoms of the world. Just as Persia's political landscape shifted and empires rose and fell, we too can trust that God remains at work in our world today, even when it seems like things are changing rapidly or falling apart. Just as Persia survived numerous conquests, so too can we rely on God to uphold us through times of trial and difficulty. The continuation of Persia's influence through the Parthians, Sassanids, and into the Islamic era also highlights the persistence of God's people and his work in the world. Even when the landscape changes, God's covenant with his people endures. The Persian people, who had once followed Zoroastrianism, would eventually become part of the Muslim world, but many still retain their Persian heritage. Their legacy, like the history of Israel, is one of transformation, survival, and God's providence working through history. The Persian story reminds us that even in the face of religious and cultural upheaval, God's plan is always unfolding, sometimes in ways we don't immediately understand. We can take comfort in knowing that, like Persia, God will continue to shape our lives and the world around us, guiding us toward his ultimate purposes for all nations and peoples. 5. Iran's modern identity and influence in the 20th century. The modern history of Iran begins with significant transformations, notably the Pahlavi dynasty's rise in the early 20th century. In 1925, Reza Shah Pahlavi took control of Iran, marking a shift toward modernization and industrialization. He sought to make Iran a powerful player on the global stage, establishing infrastructure, educational reforms, and policies aimed at strengthening the economy. However, his reign, though progressive in some ways, was also marked by authoritarian rule, which led to growing dissatisfaction among various segments of Iranian society. The most pivotal moment in Iran's modern history came in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution. Led by Ayatollah Khomeini, this revolution toppled the Pahlavi monarchy and replaced it with an Islamic theocracy, fundamentally reshaping the political landscape of the country. The establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran shifted the nation from a secular government to one rooted in Shia Islamic principles, with the supreme leader holding ultimate power over both the government and the religious sphere. From a biblical standpoint, the rise of the Islamic Republic in Iran represents a dramatic shift in the nation's spiritual and political identity. In Matthew 16:18, Jesus declares, "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." Despite the geopolitical changes in Iran, the eternal truth of God's kingdom remains unshaken. This verse reminds us that while nations and systems may change, God's church and his purposes remain steadfast. The Islamic Revolution also deepened Iran's rivalry with the West, especially with the United States and Israel. This was highlighted by the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis in 1979, which marked the beginning of a prolonged period of tension. Iran's support for militant groups in the Middle East like Hezbollah and Hamas has made it a central player in the region's ongoing conflicts, particularly in relation to Israel. Despite the turbulent political landscape, Iran's influence in the Middle East remains significant. With its vast oil reserves and strategic position, Iran has maintained its role as a key player in regional politics. From a spiritual perspective, this continued influence of Iran in global affairs is a reminder that God's sovereign plan unfolds in unexpected ways. As the biblical prophets foretold, God often works through even the most unlikely rulers and nations to fulfill His purposes. For Catholics, Iran's modern history is a reminder that we are called to live faithfully, even when the world around us seems to be changing. Just as God's plan for Persia unfolded over thousands of years, we can trust that His plan for our lives, our countries, and our world is unfolding according to His will. Even amidst uncertainty and conflict, we are called to stand firm in faith, trusting in God's eternal sovereignty. Conclusion. As we've seen throughout this journey into the history of Iran, the legacy of Persia continues to shape the modern world in ways both visible and subtle. From the rise of Cyrus the Great as God's anointed ruler to the transformation of Persia into the modern nation of Iran, God's sovereign hand has been at work through every phase of its history. Whether in the ancient empires, the rise of Islam, or the complex geopolitics of today, Iran's history is woven into the larger story of God's purposes for the nations. For us as Catholics, this historical narrative invites us to reflect on God's unshakable sovereignty. Just as He worked through Persian kings to fulfill His promises, He continues to shape the course of history today, using even the most unlikely individuals and nations to fulfill His divine will. We are called to trust in His timing and His plan, even when the world seems uncertain or when nations rise and fall. As we face challenges in our personal lives and witness the unfolding of world events, let us remember that God's plan for His people and for the world is far greater than we can imagine. While empires may crumble, God's kingdom remains eternal. We are called to live faithfully, to pray for peace, and to trust that God's will is being accomplished in ways we may not fully understand. So, let us keep our eyes on the eternal, knowing that while earthly powers may shift, God's reign is unmovable. The story of Persia, and now Iran, serves as a powerful reminder of God's control over history and His faithfulness to His promises. As we await the fulfillment of His plan, let us remain steadfast in faith, hope, and prayer, trusting that ultimately God's kingdom will prevail.